So access to land, and in particular good farmland, is something that really defines the story of Kekchi Maya mobility across Guatemala and into Belize over the last several hundred years. Kekchi were originally focused in the area of Alta Verapaz in Guatemala, and because of a series of very exploitive events that were tied with colonialism, for example, coffee barons from Germany came in and created forced labor situations for Kekchi, among other atrocities that were committed against them over the next 100 years, really kind of pushed Kekchi to migrate into more low-lying areas in Guatemala, around the Lake Izabal region and northward into Petén, and eventually across the border into what is now Belize. We also know that there were Maya communities of many different language groups that were moving back and forth across that border, what's now Belize and Guatemala, for centuries. So Maya people have been making a living in this environment for a very, very long time. We have very definitive evidence for that. And the issue of how land practices have changed over time was really the focal point of one of the grant projects that I've been working on that was funded by the National Science Foundation through their Human Social Dynamics program. And the idea behind this project was really to just capture human environmental interactions and change over a 2,000-year period. The ethnographic portion of that has really emphasized the most recent changes with regards to the ways people make a living on that landscape. And I think overall, one of perhaps the most significant things that has taken place is a very contested battle over access to land, and in particular, Maya communities coming up against barriers from the establishment of protected areas and parks, from very extractive industries like logging, mining, and petroleum extraction. It's kind of the latest contestation that they're facing, and the ways that my activists, leaders, and community members have encountered these events of what you might think of as globalization, or what gets lost as development, has been very complex over the last several hundred years.
A major factor of ecological and economic importance now is the fact that the area that the Batwa pygmies had occupied was also the area of the last remaining mountain gorilla population in the world. The forest extends down into Rwanda, and there are some mountain gorillas there, and it used to extend out into the Congo, but due to political instability, the forest and the mountain gorilla population have been decimated, as have many of the pygmy populations, such as the Mbuti, who were documented by Turnbull in the 70s. They've largely been pushed out and exterminated due to the political instability. But on the Ugandan side, the forest remained, was protected, and was occupied by both the Batwa and the mountain gorillas until the 1990s. In the 1990s, the Ugandan government expelled all of the Batwa from the forest, presumably to protect the mountain gorilla population, which can become infected by human diseases. So they expelled the Batwa, even though they weren't the ones primarily endangering the gorillas. It's really the surrounding farming populations that were cutting away at the forest that were threatening the survival of the forest itself. It was the Batwa who really suffered. When they were expelled from the forest, they were not given any compensation by the government. They had nowhere to live. They were essentially homeless. And this was not met with much compassion by the surrounding Bachiga people. They didn't understand the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The Batwa were considered backwards and were the source of much scorn and abuse. In fact, some of the Batwa reported not being able to go to the nearest hospital, which was many, many miles away, because they would be beaten on the roads as they tried to get there.
I was not very successful finding successful development programs or projects. Mainly, I believe, because these were projects. These were not sustainable practices, long-term, committed, organic or natural practices, but artificial and superficial. They were short, depending on grant monies, and detached from their source of origin as well. In some instances, I found that people working in these projects had really good intentions, but in other cases, I found that this was simply an extension of a colonialist plan.
Describe in a lot of my research on this topic of informal learning about the environment is that kids learn much of this through participation in what David Lancy calls cultural routines. And these are just the everyday habits of making a living in a particular place where you're really relying much more directly than in an industrialized setting on the flora and fauna around you to really survive and create a life in that.
One way to bring conservationists and communities together is to focus on the importance and value of traditional ecological knowledge and how ideas that have worked in the forest for thousands of years are likely to have something to offer new scientific research based on biodiversity or conservation in its various forms, and can be used and utilized and transformed through the course of new knowledge and new practices that are incorporated with traditional knowledge as an evolving process to address some of these issues. The problems arise, I think, when conservation efforts are imported without any kind of consideration.
And in the process of learning how to make a living in a particular place, one of the things I've written about in my work is that not all environmental knowledge is created equal. So in some sense, there are particular kinds of knowledge, skill, and practice associated with creating life worlds that is very generalized. It's learned very early in life. And for the most part, this happens through participation and kind of embodied experience in building skill over time in kind of a cumulative way over a person's lifetime. And most of the time, this is something that people can't even explain to you how they learned because it's so basic and fundamental to their experience. And the idea that you might want to study that is kind of hilarious to many of the people that I do research with. Now, specialized skills and practice is something quite different, and I think those are the things that oftentimes in my communities, the emphasis on cultural traditions and what counts as heritage is more often associated with specialized skills, like weaving a couche-tard, which is a brightly colored cotton bag that's used for planting corn, and men will take along with them to plantation or to the farm with their lunch on a daily basis, and it's very much iconic of Maya identity.
An example of how traditional ecological knowledge is dynamic and is used to address modern conservation concerns is illustrated by a project that took place as a collaboration with a conservation trust and communities in the Toledo district, Belize. Ladies from one community were taught to make soap, which is a traditional practice, but they were taught to relearn it, a traditional practice which had been lost, to make soap from the oil of the cocoon nut, which is a very valuable tree in the forests of southern Belize. In the process of making this soap, they traveled and taught the skill to ladies in another community who were looking for an economic opportunity to make a little extra money, and also to alleviate the burden of having to find cash to buy soap that they needed in their daily lives. They were successful in teaching these ladies how to make the soap out of the kahuna oil soap, out of kahuna nuts, and they ended up with a product that was marketable, that was desired within the community and outside the community. So they were supplying products that the other people in their community needed, using products in their community, but that were harvested sustainably and that added value to the cahoon palm by using the nut rather than cutting the cahoon balm and using it for other products or other processes that were not sustainable. So that's just a small example of how traditional practice and traditional knowledge can come together with conservation information and lead to a positive outcome. When I think about environment or environmental change in the context of development, I think about changing land use, and I think about environmental degradation as a result of this changing land use. I also think about global efforts to consider and study and address environmental degradation through scientific research and other kinds of programs. In 2012, I was hired as an anthropological consultant by an environmental conservation, a nonprofit organization in Belize, a Belizean nonprofit funded by organizations throughout Europe and the US. As part of this project that I was hired to be part of, I worked with conservation scientists to help them better understand what drives behavior of my communities living in a protected forest area. The concern of these scientists was they wanted to work with communities to conserve these natural areas, and they felt like the projects and programs they were running weren't serving the communities, and they weren't being as successful as they could be in terms of their conservation goals. So, of course, the hope of conservation science is not to be at odds with the communities that are living in the natural areas and that are most affected by environmental degradation as a result of these different development processes and changing land use practices. However, as is often the case, the players that are brought to the table don't always include those with the traditional environmental knowledge that might be useful to think about the social and cultural and economic implications of these conservation efforts. So when I gave my presentation at the conservation organization, many people were invited. There were government organizations representing environmental land use practices and best practices from the government of Belize. There were nonprofit arms of small businesses that came to hear what I had to say about working with the local communities as well as members from many different nonprofit organizations in southern Belize. They welcomed the anthropological input, but still, I don't know that we were left with too many answers.